Mara Ellison had buried her husband, emptied most of her savings, and learned how quickly a quiet life could collapse. So, when a lawyer called to say her estranged father had left her an abandoned lighthouse on the edge of Grayhaven, she didn't see an inheritance. She saw one last thing to sell. Blackwater Point had been rotting for 30 years. Ever since the night a cargo ship struck the reef, and the town blamed her father for letting the lighthouse go dark. Mara had been 12 when people began calling him a coward. He never defended himself. He barely defended himself to her. But on her first night inside the crumbling station, Mara found an old tide chart still pinned behind the keeper's desk. One stretch of time had been circled in red pencil, 2-1-1-2, 28A. M. Beside it, in her father's handwriting, were two words, light, dark. If he had truly fallen asleep that night, why had he recorded the exact 17 minutes? The beacon was off. The answer was buried beneath the lighthouse, and it would change everything Mara believed about her father. Mara Ellison had learned that grief was expensive. It emptied a house one object at a time, then kept sending bills after the person you loved was gone. 21 months after Daniel's funeral, she was still paying off the last of his hospital expenses, still catching herself buying the coffee he liked, still waking some mornings with the brief, merciful belief that he was downstairs making toast. At 42, Mara had become skilled at correcting herself. Daniel was dead. The small bookkeeping business she ran from her laptop paid the rent on her apartment in Portland. But little more. Her savings had fallen below $4,000, and the landlord had already mentioned another increase when the lease renewed. So when a lawyer from Grayhaven called to tell her that Elias Ellison had died and left her Blackwater Point light station, Mara's first feeling was not sadness. It was irritation. Her second was shame for feeling irritated. Her third, once the lawyer mentioned that 11 acres of coastal land came with the lighthouse, was practical calculation. Land could be sold. Debts could be paid. A life could perhaps be made smaller and safer. She had not seen her father in 6 years. Their last phone call had lasted 4 minutes and ended with both of them pretending there would be another one. There never was. A week later, Mara drove north through rain that followed the windshield like gray smoke, carrying 2 suitcases, Daniel's old thermos, and the brass key the attorney had mailed her. Grayhaven looked smaller than she remembered. The harbor still curved beneath the hill like a dark hook. The church steeple still rose above the cedar roofs. But the grocery store where her mother once bought birthday cakes was now a pharmacy. And the diner had become a polished cafe with outdoor heaters no one was using. Blackwater Point lay 3 miles beyond town. At the end of a narrow road lined with wind-bent spruce, Mara saw the lighthouse before she saw the keeper's house. The tower stood on the cliff like a bone left in the weather. Its white paint peeled away in long strips. Its lantern room, black against the afternoon sky. Beside it, crouched a 2-story house with boarded windows and a sagging porch. 30 years earlier, the sight of that tower had meant home. Then, in one terrible night, it became the thing everyone in Grayhaven whispered about when they thought 12-year-old Mara could not hear. The Caledonia had struck Needle Reef during a February storm. 23 people had died. The lighthouse beam had gone dark some time before the wreck, and her father had been the keeper on duty. No criminal charge had ever been filed. But Grayhaven had not needed a courtroom. People decided Elias had fallen asleep, or been drinking, or simply abandoned his post. At school, a boy had once asked Mara how it felt to have a father who let people drown. She broke his nose and was suspended for 3 days. Elias did not scold her. He did not defend himself either. People need someone to blame, he had said. Mara hated him for that answer almost as much as she hated the accusation. At Blackwater Point, she parked beside knee-high grass and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Sell it, she reminded herself. The attorney had already forwarded an inquiry from North Coast Heritage Resorts, a development company interested in turning the property into luxury vacation cottages. Their preliminary offer was more money than Mara had expected. Enough to erase Daniel's remaining medical debt, enough for a deposit on a modest condo. Enough, perhaps, to stop measuring groceries against the balance in her checking account. She unlocked the keeper's house. Cold, salt-heavy air greeted her. Dust lay across the furniture. But the place had not been emptied. Her father's boots remained by the back door. A chipped blue mug sat upside down beside the kitchen sink. For one disorienting second, Mara expected him to walk in from the tower. Older and thinner, but alive, asking why she had come without calling. She looked away from the mug. "I'm selling it," she said aloud, though there was no one there to argue. The electricity had been disconnected months earlier, so she used a flashlight as dusk approached. She checked the roof leaks, photographed damaged windows for the realtor, and made a list of things that might have value: antique brass fittings, maritime charts, an oak desk too heavy for her to move alone. The desk stood in the old keeper's room, connecting the house to the tower. Its drawers contained pencils, rusted clips, maintenance receipts, and nothing that explained why Elias had preserved a room everyone else would have wanted to forget. Then Mara noticed something pinned behind a faded calendar. It was an old tide chart, yellow at the edges. The printed date made her stop breathing for a moment. February 18, 30 years earlier, the night the Caledonia went down. Mara pulled the chart free. Most of it was covered with her father's familiar pencil marks: wind direction, tide height, barometric pressure, near the bottom. One interval had been circled hard enough to crease the paper. 2:11 a.m. 2, do, auto, a.m. 17 minutes. Beside the circle, Elias had written 2 words: light, dark. Mara read them twice, then a third time. The official inquiry had said the exact time of the outage could not be established because Elias claimed not to remember when the beacon failed. That uncertainty had followed him for the rest of his life. But here was his handwriting recording not only that the light had gone out, but precisely when. Mara felt an old anger rise, sharpened now by something colder. "You knew," she whispered. A floorboard creaked beneath her as she stepped back from the desk. Something small rolled from underneath it and struck her boot. Mara bent down. It was a brass key, darker and smaller than the key to the house, tied to a length of faded red cord. A tiny metal tag hung from the ring. No number, no label, only a single stamped letter B. Mara spent the next 20 minutes trying it in every lock she could find. The desk drawers, the tower door, the maintenance cabinet, the old fuel closet. Nothing. Outside, the wind strengthened, pushing rain against the windows. Mara returned to the tide chart and held the flashlight closer. 17 minutes of darkness. A hidden key. A father who had allowed an entire town, and his own daughter, to believe he had forgotten the most important 17 minutes of his life. She had come to Blackwater Point thinking the lighthouse was simply the last bad thing Elias Ellison had left her. Standing alone in the room where his reputation had died, Mara began to wonder whether he had left her something else instead. A question. And perhaps, somewhere in the decaying station, the reason he had never answered it. Mara slept badly that night in the narrow upstairs bedroom that had once been hers. The mattress smelled faintly of dust and salt, and every gust off the ocean made the old house complain around her. Twice she woke convinced she had heard footsteps in the hall, only to remember there was no one left here but her. By 6 in the morning she had given up on sleep. She made instant coffee with bottled water, wrapped both hands around Daniel's thermos, and stared through the kitchen window at the lighthouse tower, disappearing into fog. The tide chart lay on the table beside the small brass key. 17 minutes. 2, 1. 1, 2, 2, 2, 8. Light, dark. She had spent half the night telling herself it proved nothing. Elias might have written the Times afterward. He might have been reconstructing events for the inquiry. The key might belong to an old cabinet that no longer existed. Reasonable explanations were easy to invent when the alternative was admitting that the story she had lived with since childhood might have been incomplete. Mara opened her laptop and searched through the digital copies of the Caledonia inquiry that the Grayhaven Historical Society had posted online years earlier. She remembered parts of the report almost word for word, but she forced herself to read it as if she were seeing it for the first time. At, doi, trezeci și patru a. M. The Caledonia transmitted a distress call, reporting loss of steering near Needle Reef. At 2:41. The hull struck rock. Several witnesses later said the Blackwater beacon had been unreliable earlier that night. Elias testified that a mechanical fault had interrupted the lamp, but when investigators asked for the exact time, he said he could not be certain. Mara stared at that sentence until the letters blurred. Could not be certain, yet he had circled the precise interval on the chart. She closed the laptop and picked up the brass key. Fine, she murmured. Show me what it opens. In daylight. She searched the keeper's house more systematically. She checked the attic trunks, the old fuse box, the storage closets, even a rusted cabinet behind the pantry. Nothing. Then she entered the tower itself. The iron stairs spiraled upward through stale, cold air. She stopped at each landing, testing the key wherever she found a lock, but none accepted it. By late morning, annoyed with herself for caring, she returned downstairs and noticed a draft moving through the maintenance room beneath the connecting passage. One wall was lined with wooden shelves holding coils of rope, lantern parts, paint cans turned solid with age, and tools Elias had arranged by size. Mara began pulling things away from the wall. Behind a stack of rotting timber, she found an iron ring set low into the stonework. She tugged. A narrow metal panel shifted outward with a scrape that sent dust across the floor. There was a keyhole beneath the ring. Mara froze. The brass key slid in easily. The lock turned. Behind the panel, crude, concrete steps descended into darkness. She almost laughed from nerves. The lighthouse foundation had been rebuilt after a storm in the 1950s, but she had never known there was usable space beneath it. She grabbed the flashlight, tested each step with her weight, and descended. The chamber below was barely tall enough for her to stand upright. The stone walls sweated moisture. Pipes ran overhead, and old maintenance valves protruded from one side. At first, she saw nothing except discarded equipment. Then her flashlight caught the dull shine of metal behind a support column. A rectangular waterproof case sat wedged between two stones. It was not locked. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas, he was a black notebook, swollen slightly with age but dry. Mara carried it upstairs before opening it. The first pages were covered in her father's handwriting. not diary entries. Numbers, tide heights, wind speeds, water temperatures, current directions measured at different times and locations around Blackwater Point. Elias had always been obsessive about the sea. When Mara was little, he could look at foam around a rock and tell her which way the current would turn in an hour. She had thought every lighthouse keeper knew things like that. Only later did she realize her father had spent years making his own maps of water movement around the reefs. The notebook seemed to be one of those private studies. Mara flipped forward until the dates reached February 18. Her fingers stopped. The page was dense with entries made every few minutes. 1, 4, 8, North Channel, running 2, 6 knots. 1, 5, 6, pressure falling. 2, 0, 3 outer reef obscured. Then, at doi opt. The handwriting changed. The lines became shorter, harder, as if Elias had been writing quickly. 209S17, holding outside reef. 211. Current changes. Light, dark. Mara felt a chill unrelated to the cold room. Below it were more figures. Depth readings. Bearings. Then 219 crossing North Cut. 226 inside line. 228 light. Restored. Green signal received. Mara read the sequence again. There was no confusion in the handwriting. No hint of a mechanical failure. Elias had been tracking something called S17 through the water, while the lighthouse was dark. She turned the page, expecting an explanation. Instead, she found only tide calculations and one sketched route through a narrow passage between Needle Reef and the cliffs. Mara knew that passage. Local fishing boats avoided it even in daylight. The depth changed dramatically with the tide, and underwater rock shelves could tear open a hull. Why would her father chart a route through it during a storm? She returned to the inquiry report. The Caledonia's first distress transmission had come at 2, 3, 4, 6 minutes after Elias wrote that the beacon had been restored. Mara checked 3 times. Certain she had made a mistake. She had not. If the times in her father's notebook were accurate, the lighthouse was already shining when the Caledonia reported losing control. That did not prove the darkness had nothing to do with the wreck. But it shattered the simple story Grayhaven had repeated for 30 years. Mara drove into town that afternoon and went to the public library, where archived newspapers were stored on microfilm. The articles were worse than she remembered. Keeper questioned after deadly wreck. Blackwater light dark during storm. Families of the dead demanded answers. One editorial called Elias a man whose silence insults the drowned. Mara almost stopped reading. Then she noticed something buried in a smaller article printed 2 days after the disaster. A rescue volunteer had reported seeing an unidentified light offshore shortly before the Caledonia distress call. But investigators later dismissed it as storm reflection. Mara copied the article and returned to the lighthouse before dark. On the kitchen table, she placed the newspaper beside the tide chart and the hidden notebook. 17 minutes of darkness. A green signal, an unidentified light offshore, and S17. Whatever that meant. Waiting beyond the reef while Elias measured the current minute by minute. Mara had wanted evidence that her father had not failed. Instead, she had found something more unsettling. He had known exactly what he was doing. And for the first time, she understood that the question was no longer whether Elias Ellison had turned off the lighthouse. The question was what he had needed those 17 minutes of darkness to hide. By the 3rd morning, Mara had stopped thinking of the lighthouse as something she could empty in a weekend. She still kept the developer's offer folded inside her laptop case, and she still told herself she intended to sign it. But the papers now felt like they belonged to a different problem. The problem in front of her was S-17. She spread Elias's notebook across the kitchen table beside a coastal chart and traced the route he had drawn through the North Cut. The numbers bothered her. They were too shallow for a freighter, too narrow for any commercial vessel that would willingly approach Grayhaven in a storm. She remembered her father teaching her to read depth marks when she was 8, his finger moving slowly across a chart while he explained that the ocean had roads just as land did. Except the roads moved. The route in the notebook was not a road. It was a slit between submerged rock shelves. Mara drove to the harbor and found Noah Bell repairing a crab pot behind a weathered blue shed. She remembered him as a broad-shouldered rescue diver with black hair and a voice that could be heard over an engine. At 71, he was thinner, white-bearded, and moved carefully when he stood. His expression changed the moment Mara introduced herself. "Elias's girl," he said. Not a question. Mara disliked how quickly she became 12 years old again in the eyes of someone who had known her father. She took a photocopy of the notebook page from her bag and placed it on the workbench. "Do you know what S-17 means?" Noah looked at the paper for several seconds too long. "No. You didn't even read the whole page." His jaw tightened. "Some things around here are old enough to leave alone." Mara almost laughed. "That worked wonderfully for my family." She pointed to the entry. "My father recorded something outside Needle Reef while the light was off. 6 minutes after he turned it back on. The Caledonia sent its distress call. I need to know what he was watching." Noah folded the crab net slowly. "Your father made his choices, and everyone else got to explain them for him." Noah finally met her eyes. For a moment, Mara thought he would walk away. Instead, he asked, "Did you find his current book?" The fact that he knew such a book existed answered more than he intended. Mara felt her pulse quicken. What was out there? Noah stared toward the harbor. "I was 21. Volunteer rescue crew. We were already on standby because of the storm. Around 2:20. Maybe a little earlier. I was on the South Breakwater checking a skiff line when the lighthouse went black. And I saw something where nothing should have been." He described a long shape beyond the reef. Low in the water. Nearly invisible, beneath rain and spray. No running lights, no deck lights. At first, Noah thought it was debris. Then, it moved against the waves. "A boat?" Mara asked. Noah shook his head. "Not like any boat I knew." He hesitated. Looked more like the back of a submarine. The word seemed absurd inside the ordinary harbor morning. Mara looked at the fishing boats. The gulls circling a dumpster. A man carrying ice into the bait shop. "A submarine came through Needle Reef. I didn't say through. My father's notes do." Noah's face hardened again. But the secret had already slipped loose. He told her that after the dark shape disappeared behind the northern rocks, he saw a green light blink twice near the hidden cove below Blackwater Point. Later, while rescue crews were preparing to respond to the Caledonia. Noah glimpsed a small motorboat moving from that cove toward an old service road. There were people packed inside. How many, Mara asked? Couldn't tell. More than 10. Maybe 20. Crew. There were children. That stopped her. Noah remembered one clearly because the child had been wrapped in a pale blanket, held against someone's chest beneath the rain. None of those people appeared in the official reports. Noah had mentioned the strange vessel once to a regional officer after the wreck. The officer told him he had seen storm debris and advised him not to complicate an investigation already full of grief. "Why didn't you tell anyone else?" Mara asked. Noah looked exhausted rather than defensive. because by sunrise, 23 people were dead. And your father was already the man everyone wanted to blame. Nobody was interested in a mystery boat. Mara returned to Blackwater Point with more questions than she had taken into town. She went through the keeper's room again. Then the cupboards. Then boxes Elias had stacked in the narrow hallway. Near sunset, she removed a faded photograph of the old Lighthouse crew from the wall because she thought the frame might be worth keeping. Something slid behind it. A second photograph had been hidden between the backing board and the wall. Mara carried it to the window. Elias stood outside the keeper's house, younger than she remembered him, surrounded by strangers. There were 19 people in the picture. Men, women, several children. Their clothes were mismatched and oversized, as if donated in a hurry. One woman held a bundled infant. Behind them, partly hidden by fog, stood Noah Bell. Mara turned the photograph over. Her father had written one sentence across the back. They needed darkness more than we needed credit. Mara sat down on the floor. For 30 years, she had imagined Elias's silence as weakness. Cowardice. Perhaps. Shame. But the man in the photograph did not look ashamed. He looked tired and watchful, with one hand resting on the shoulder of a boy Mara had never seen. A memory came without permission, Daniel, in the final months of his illness, asking Mara to call her sister because she could not keep managing everything alone. Mara had refused. She had told herself that silence protected other people from her pain. In truth, it had mostly made her lonely. After Daniel died, she had become even better at disappearing. Maybe Elias had done the same thing for different reasons. Maybe he had convinced himself that bearing something alone was the same as protecting the people he loved. Mara hated how much she understood that. She studied the photograph again and noticed a small mark written beside one man's shoulder. As D's said, not a person. She realized a designation. The people in the photograph had come from the vessel. The lighthouse had not gone dark because Elias forgot his duty. He had made it dark so something hidden could reach the shore. But one question now outweighed all the others. Who were these people? And what danger could have been great enough that her father chose to sacrifice his name rather than let the world know they had arrived? The offer from North Coast Heritage Resorts arrived again the next morning, this time with a deadline. Mara read the email twice while standing in the kitchen with Elias's hidden photograph beside her laptop. The company had increased its preliminary offer by 12%, provided she signed a letter of intent within 5 business days. They would handle demolition permits, environmental review, even the overdue property taxes. The number on the screen was large enough to make her stomach tighten. She could pay the last of Daniel's medical debt, move somewhere smaller, rebuild her savings, and stop waking at 3 in the morning calculating how many months she could survive if bookkeeping work slowed down. The sensible choice was almost embarrassingly clear. Then rain tapped the window, and Mara looked toward the tower where 17 minutes of darkness had destroyed her father's reputation. She closed the email without answering. That afternoon, she returned to Elias's current notebook and began copying his measurements onto a modern chart. It took hours before the pattern emerged. He had not simply recorded the tide. He had calculated a passage between 211 and 228. The current through the north cut would have turned sharply inward, strong enough to pull a low vessel through the narrow channel with very little engine power. Mara called Noah. This time he came to the lighthouse. He stood over the chart in Elias's old keeper's room, saying nothing while Mara traced the route with a pencil. Whatever S-17 was, she said. My father wanted it almost silent. Noah rubbed a hand over his beard. Yes, You knew. Not all of it. Then tell me the part you do know. He walked to the window and looked toward Needle Reef. For several seconds, Mara thought he might refuse again. Then he said, "It was a submarine, not military. At least not anymore." According to Noah, S-17 had once been a small coastal patrol submarine belonging to a foreign regime that had seized power after years of civil conflict. A group of officers had defected with civilians hidden aboard dissidents. Translators, families of people marked for arrest, and several children. They had crossed open water under false identification. But a naval surveillance vessel loyal to the regime had followed them toward the coast. "Why come here?" Mara asked. "Because your father knew the reefs better than anyone alive." Noah explained that an aid network had contacted Elias through a retired merchant captain he trusted. The plan was desperate. S-17 could not enter Grayhaven harbor without being noticed, and it could not remain offshore until daylight. The hidden cove beneath Blackwater Point was deep enough at high tide, but reaching it required crossing the North Cut. Worse, the lighthouse beam swept directly across the water above that passage. In heavy rain, the beam itself would not reveal much, but when it crossed the wet hull of a surfaced submarine, it could create a visible flash against the dark sea. If the pursuing vessel was watching, one sweep might be enough. Mara stared at him. "So, my father turned it off." Noah nodded. "For 17 minutes. The number sounded different now. Not like missing time. Like a decision. Elias had calculated the current so 17 could reduce its engines, drift through the reef, reach the cove, and signal green once everyone was safely inside." Mara felt something like relief begin inside her. But it did not last. And the Caledonia Noah's face changed. That's the part that ruined him. They returned to the notebook. Elias had written the Caledonia's position twice before the blackout, using bearings from its navigation lights between breaks in the storm. At Doi, Chasse, 5 minutes before the beacon went dark, the freighter was already south of its normal approach line. Mara compared the bearing to the official route map and felt her pulse quicken. She checked again. It was already off course. Yes. Before he touched the light, Noah nodded. The storm damaged her steering. That came out later. But by then, people had already decided what happened. The official distress call at 234 confirmed loss of steering. Elias restored the beacon at 228. By then, according to his calculations, the Caledonia's speed and position placed her inside the turning distance needed to clear Needle Reef. The darkness had not put the ship there, but proving that in the original inquiry would have required Elias to explain why he knew the exact blackout interval, why he had intentionally disabled the beacon, and what he had been guiding through the rocks. He could have cleared his name, Mara said quietly. Maybe. Noah looked at the photograph on the desk and put every one of those people on a list. Some of the refugees still had parents, siblings, or children behind. Public confirmation of the defection could have identified families helping them escape. The aid network had warned that reprisals were already occurring. Elias had been asked to keep the landing secret until the refugees were safely resettled. Then the Caledonia wrecked less than 20 minutes later, and secrecy became something heavier. Mara sank into her father's chair. For 30 years, she had wanted one clean answer, innocent or guilty. Instead, she had found a man who had broken one duty because he believed another duty mattered more. Then accepted blame for a tragedy he had not caused, because defending himself could endanger people who had trusted him. "He still let me believe it," she said. Noah did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said at last. That hurt more than Mara expected. She could understand protecting frightened families from a hostile government. She could even understand keeping silent before investigators. What she could not understand was the years afterward. The schoolyard whispers, the broken friendships. The way Elias had retreated into himself, while Mara learned to be ashamed of the same last name. That evening, after Noah left, Mara found another notation in the back of the current book, a column of numbers labeled only S17. 21 entries in all. No names. No addresses. Just numbers. She realized what they were before she could prove it. The people in the photograph. Elias had protected their identities even in his private records. Mara looked at the developer's contract again. Selling the Lighthouse would be easy. Publishing the notebook might also be easy. She could show everyone that the Caledonia had been off course before the blackout and finally clear Elias Ellison's name. But if she released everything, those coded entries might lead someone to the people he had spent 30 years protecting. And if she walked away now, the truth might disappear with the building. Mara closed the contract. Somewhere, in this lighthouse, she believed, Elias had left one final explanation. Not for Grayhaven. For Hare. The question was whether she was prepared to hear why saving strangers had seemed worth losing his own daughter. Mara found the letter the next morning inside Daniel's thermos. At first she thought she had put it there herself without remembering. But the folded envelope was old. Its paper softened at the creases, and her name was written across the front in Elias's unmistakable hand. Mara. She sat down hard at the kitchen table. For several seconds, she could not make herself open it. The thermos had belonged to Daniel. But before that it had belonged to Elias. Mara had taken it from the lighthouse when she left home at 18. Mostly because she knew her father used it every winter. She had carried it through college, marriage, hospital waiting rooms, and the long months after Daniel died without ever noticing that the false metal base could unscrew. Elias must have hidden the letter there years ago, perhaps believing that one day she would discover it. Inside were 4 pages and a small key taped to the last one. Mara read slowly. Elias did not begin by defending himself. He began by apologizing. He wrote that there were explanations a father could keep from the world and explanations he had no right to keep from his child, and that he had confused the two. Then he told her what happened after S-17 entered the cove. 21 people came ashore that night. 4 were children. 2 families had already lost relatives to arrests. Others still had parents and siblings inside the country they had escaped. The officers who brought them out warned that if the defection became public, the government hunting them would punish anyone connected to their names. Elias agreed to silence because he believed it would last weeks, perhaps months. Then the Caledonia struck Needle Reef. By Dan. Reporters were outside the station. By noon, people were saying the dark lighthouse had killed 23 sailors. Elias wrote that he nearly told investigators everything. He even prepared a statement explaining S-17, but the aid network contacted him first. One refugee's brother had already been detained back home. Another family had received threats. Revealing the landing could turn suspicion into certainty. So Elias surrendered his explanation. He gave investigators the technical facts he could give without naming the second vessel, accepted suspension, and let the unanswered questions harden into judgment. I told myself people would forget. He wrote, I was wrong. Mara stopped reading there because her eyes had filled. After a while, she continued. Elias knew what the town's anger had done to her. He knew about the schoolyard fights. He knew she had stopped inviting friends home. He knew she began using her mother's maiden name on college applications. He had seen all of it, and still said almost nothing. I thought silence was the price of keeping them safe. He wrote, I did not understand that I was asking you to pay it too. Mara pressed the page against the table with both hands. For 30 years, she had wanted her father to explain why strangers had mattered more than she did. The letter gave her the answer she had not expected. They had not mattered more. He had simply failed to see that protecting one group did not excuse abandoning another person emotionally. Elias wrote that his greatest regret was not Grayhaven's hatred. It was letting Mara mistake his silence for indifference. The small key opened a cedar box hidden behind a loose panel beneath the staircase. Inside were photographs, postcards, graduation announcements, wedding invitations, and Christmas cards spanning nearly 3 decades. The people from S-17 had built lives. The boy whose shoulder Elias had touched in the hidden photograph became an emergency room doctor. The woman holding the infant opened a bakery in Minnesota. One of the children became a teacher. Another served in the Coast Guard. Elias had kept every update they sent. He had protected their names. But he had never forgotten them. At the bottom of the box was a recent envelope addressed to him. The sender was Anton Valev, one of the surviving adults from S-17. Mara called the number inside. Anton arrived at Blackwater Point 2 days later. A slight man in his 70s, carrying a photograph in a wooden frame. He stood in the keeper's room and cried before saying a word. The photograph showed 21 people gathered at a picnic nearly 10 years after the landing. Children taller, babies grown. Families expanded. Your father saved us, Anton said. Mara shook her head. And people died here that same night. Yes. Anton did not soften it. That is why he never called himself a hero. He told Mara that Elias had refused every attempt to publicly thank him. When the refugees finally became citizens and the political danger faded, some urged him to tell the truth. Elias still hesitated, because the families of the Caledonia dead had lived for years with one explanation. He feared that defending himself too loudly would look like using rescued refugees to erase their grief. Instead, he documented everything and waited for a time when the evidence could speak without exposing anyone. Mara understood then why the lighthouse had been left to her rather than sold. Elias had not left her a burden. He had left her the choice he had never been able to make for her. She spent the next week with a maritime historian, an attorney, Noah, and Anton reviewing the notebook, weather reports, tide calculations, and the Caledonia timeline. They released only what was necessary. The record showed the freighter had been outside the safe approach line before 211 and had reported steering failure after the beacon was restored. It also showed that Elias deliberately extinguished the light for 17 minutes to guide another vessel through the reef. The identities of the S-17 families remained private unless they chose otherwise. Several chose to speak. Grayhaven did not transform overnight. Some families of the dead remained angry that Elias had violated his duty at all. Mara did not ask them to forgive him. What mattered was that the official historical record was corrected. Elias Ellison had not fallen asleep, had not abandoned his station, and had not caused the Caledonia to lose steering. The truth was more complicated than innocence and guilt. It usually was. Mara declined North Coast Heritage Resort's offer. Keeping Blackwater Point frightened her more than selling it. The roof still leaked. The foundation needed work. Her bookkeeping income had not magically increased. But the State Preservation Board agreed to fund part of the restoration after the station's history was formally documented. And several S-17 families contributed what they could. Noah volunteered labor. Anton returned with his grandchildren to repaint the keeper's house. Mara kept the upstairs rooms as her home and turned the old maintenance wing into a small maritime history center devoted not to heroes, but to rescue, migration, difficult choices, and the people who lived because someone decided they mattered. Months later, on the first evening, the restored beacon was tested. Mara climbed alone to the lantern room. Elias's old tide chart hung beneath the window. The 17 minutes still circled in red. Daniel's thermos sat beside it. Below, the sea moved dark and steady around Needle Reef. A fishing boat returning late flashed its light from beyond the harbor line. Mara placed her hand on the switch. For most of her life, she had believed Blackwater Point was the place where a light failed and her family broke apart. Now she understood that a light could mean different things depending on who needed it. 30 years earlier, Elias had turned one off so 21 people could disappear safely into the darkness. Mara turned it on. The beam crossed the water, swept the reef, and returned again. She watched until the fishing boat changed course toward home.